Picture this: the delicate, swirling arabesques of the Alhambra's walls, each curve whispering secrets of a bygone era, standing just a stone's throw away from the towering, light-filled arches of a Gothic cathedral. These aren't just buildings, they're silent witnesses to one of history's most fascinating cultural collisions. What happens when two great civilizations, each with its own faith, art, and vision of the world, share the same land for centuries? The answer lies in the very stones beneath your feet in Spain, where every corner tells a story of clash and compromise, of conflict and unexpected harmony. This is the cultural tug-of-war hidden in the walls of Islamic and Christian Spain, a drama played out not just on battlefields but in the patterns of tiles, the melodies of music, and even the flavors of its cuisine. For over 700 years, the Iberian Peninsula was a stage where Islam and Christianity danced a complex, often contentious duet. It wasn't just about conquest and reconquest, it was about how people lived, how they worshipped, and how they built their world. The Alhambra's geometric perfection and the cathedral's soaring heights aren't just architectural feats, they're declarations of identity, each saying, "We are here." But between these grand statements, something remarkable happened. In the markets, the workshops, and the quiet streets of cities like Córdoba and Toledo, a shared culture quietly took root. Artists borrowed techniques, scholars exchanged ideas, and cooks blended flavors, creating something entirely new from the old. This wasn't just a clash, it was a conversation, one that shaped the soul of Spain in ways that still echo today. Why does this matter now? Because Spain's past is a mirror for our own world, where cultures mix and sometimes collide. The questions medieval Spaniards faced: how to live alongside those who believe differently, how to build a shared future without erasing the past, are questions we're still asking. Over the next minutes, we'll trace this extraordinary journey from the fall of Visigothic rule to the final moments of the Reconquista. You'll meet rulers who defied expectations, artists who crossed boundaries, and ordinary people who found ways to thrive in a divided world. This isn't just history, it's a testament to human creativity in the face of division. So let's step into the shadows of these walls together, because the stories they hold might just surprise you. In the year 711, a small force of Moorish troops crossed the strait separating North Africa from Spain, a move that would change the peninsula forever. The Visigothic rulers, weakened by infighting and unrest, crumbled before the advancing armies with shocking speed. Within just a few years, most of Iberia fell under Islamic control, marking the birth of Al-Andalus. This wasn't just a conquest, it was the beginning of a cultural revolution. The Umayyad rulers who took charge didn't just impose their faith, they transformed the land into a crossroads of ideas, where scholars, artists, and inventors from across the Muslim world and beyond could thrive. At the heart of this new era stood Córdoba, a city that dazzled visitors with its sophistication. By the 10th century, its streets were lit at night, a luxury unheard of in much of Europe, while its great mosque, with its forest of red and white arches, became a symbol of Al-Andalus's grandeur. The city's libraries held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, preserving not just Islamic scholarship but the works of ancient Greek and Roman thinkers, later translated by teams of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars working side by side. Public baths, hospitals, and even street paving reflected a society that valued knowledge, hygiene, and civic life in ways that left neighboring kingdoms in awe. But Al-Andalus was more than just monuments. It was a place where, for a time, the three Abrahamic faiths found a fragile balance. The dhimmi system allowed Jews and Christians to practice their religions under certain conditions, and in the markets of Toledo or Seville, Arabic, Latin, and Hebrew could be heard in the same breath. This wasn't perfect. Coexistence taxes and social hierarchies still favored Muslims, but it stood in stark contrast to the religious intolerance brewing elsewhere in Europe. Yet even as Al-Andalus reached its peak, the seeds of change were growing in the north. Small Christian kingdoms, clinging to the mountainous edges of the peninsula, began to stir. Their resistance started as scattered raids, but would slowly grow into something far more ambitious, a movement that would eventually redraw the map of Spain. But before we trace that struggle, let's pause to appreciate what Al-Andalus achieved in its golden age, because its legacy, from algebra to citrus fruits, would outlast even its own rulers. While Al-Andalus flourished in the south, the rugged peaks of northern Spain sheltered a very different world. Here, in the misty green valleys of Asturias and Leon, tiny Christian kingdoms clung to survival like wildflowers pushing through cracks in stone. These weren't the mighty empires of legend, just scattered fortresses and villages ruled by local warlords who still called themselves Goths, clinging to the memory of Visigothic Spain. But from these humble beginnings, something extraordinary would grow. The Battle of Covadonga in the year 718 became their founding myth, a tale of divine favor against impossible odds. According to chroniclers, a small band of Asturian rebels, led by a shadowy figure named Pelayo, defeated a much larger Moorish force in a narrow mountain pass. Whether by strategy or miracle, the victory was spun into legend. Christian armies claimed the Virgin Mary herself intervened, sending rocks tumbling onto the invaders. True or not, Covadonga became a symbol, proof that resistance was possible, that God hadn't abandoned Iberia's Christians. Life in these northern realms was harsh. Unlike Al-Andalus's glittering cities, their capitals were little more than wooden forts. Yet they preserved what southerners had lost: the Latin liturgy, Visigothic law codes, and a fierce sense of identity as the true Spain. Monks in damp scriptoria painstakingly copied old texts, keeping alive traditions that might have vanished. But isolation couldn't last forever. As Al-Andalus fractured into rival Taifa kingdoms, these Christian rulers saw their chance. Slowly, cautiously, they began pushing south, not just as conquerors, but as colonists. The Reconquista wasn't a single war. It was a centuries-long ebb and flow of borders, alliances, and betrayals. Early victories were small: a castle seized here, a valley reclaimed there, but each one shifted the balance. And here's the twist: the longer these Christian kingdoms fought Al-Andalus, the more they absorbed from it. Mozarabic Christians, those who'd lived under Muslim rule, brought back Arabic-influenced art and architecture. Even the word Reconquista itself, coined much later, reflects this cultural borrowing. It's built on an Arabic root meaning to conquer. By the 10th century, Leon's rulers were minting gold coins imitating Islamic dinars, while pilgrims crossing northern Spain to Santiago de Compostela marveled at churches blending Romanesque arches with Moorish decorative motifs. The very enemies these kingdoms fought would reshape them in ways no one could have predicted. But that's the paradox of history. Sometimes, to reclaim your past, you must first embrace the foreign. And as we'll soon see, this dance of resistance and imitation would reach its peak in a place called Toledo, where the lines between victor and vanquished blurred beyond recognition. Between the rigid divides of faith and power, a remarkable group of people carved out a space neither fully one nor the other: the Mozarabs and Mudejars. These weren't just communities living under foreign rule. They were cultural alchemists, quietly weaving threads of Islamic and Christian traditions into something entirely new. Take the Mozarabs, Christians who chose to stay in Al-Andalus after the conquest. They prayed in churches but spoke Arabic in the streets, dressed in Andalusian fashions, and even adopted the elegant cursive script of their rulers for copying the Bible. Their liturgy, though Christian, echoed with the nasal melodies of Moorish music, and their art, like the stunning Beatus manuscripts, burst with vibrant colors and intricate patterns borrowed directly from Islamic book illumination. To some hardliners in the north, they seemed suspiciously assimilated, even heretical, but in truth, they were proof that faith could adapt without fading. Then there were the Mudéjars, Muslims who found themselves on the other side of history as Christian kingdoms expanded south. Rather than flee or convert, they negotiated their place, becoming indispensable craftsmen, farmers, and builders in a Christian-dominated world. Their influence is etched into Spain's very skyline. Think of the Mudéjar towers of Teruel, where brickwork dances with geometric stars and lace like stucco, all crowning a church bell tower. These artisans didn't just work for Christian patrons, they reshaped Christian architecture itself, infusing Gothic cathedrals with horseshoe arches and covering palace walls in arabesques. Critics accused them of clinging to the past, but their genius lay in synthesis, not nostalgia. The question of loyalty haunted both groups. Were Mozarabs betraying Christ by adopting the language and customs of Islamic rulers? Were Mudéjars undermining the Reconquista by preserving their traditions under Christian kings? The answer lies in the spaces they built literally. In Toledo's Church of San Ramon, frescoes of saints share walls with Cufic inscriptions praising Allah. In Seville's Alcazar, a Christian king employed Mudéjar workers to carve Quranic verses into his private chambers. This wasn't hypocrisy. It was a quiet rebellion against the idea that identity must be pure. What emerged from this middle ground was art that defies labels. Mozarabic manuscripts like the Commentary on the Apocalypse blend Byzantine iconography with Islamic decorative borders, creating a visual language that's neither wholly Eastern nor Western. Mudéjar ceilings, with their dizzying constellations of carved wood, turn Christian palaces into portals of another world. These weren't mere imitations, they were conversations in brick, pigment, and parchment. And as we'll see next, this fusion reached its zenith in a city where the walls themselves seemed to whisper in two languages: Toledo, the crucible of coexistence. Walk through the great mosque of Cordoba and you'll feel history shift beneath your feet. One moment, you're beneath rows of candy-striped arches, their hypnotic rhythm echoing the deserts of Damascus. The next, you're standing in the nave of a Renaissance cathedral, its soaring vaults bathed in golden light. This isn't just a building with two faces, it's a living argument in stone. When Christian conquerors took Cordoba in the 13th century, they didn't raise the mosque, they hollowed out its center, grafting their worship space onto its bones. The result, a place where the call to prayer once mingled with the scent of incense, where mihrab and altar stand as uneasy neighbors. This architectural duality wasn't unique. Across Spain, builders blurred lines with every brick. In Sahagun's Mozarabic churches, horseshoe arches long associated with Islamic palaces framed Christian altars, their curves carrying whispers of the south. The Alcazar of Seville took the opposite approach. A Christian king, Pedro the Cruel, commissioned Muslim craftsmen to construct his palace, filling its courts with delicate stucco foliage and Quranic inscriptions. At first glance, it seems paradoxical, a ruler waging the Reconquista while sleeping under ceilings adorned with Allah's name. But look closer, and you'll see strategy in the splendor. These weren't just buildings, they were power plays, claiming the prestige of Al-Andalus while erasing its political independence. Yet something unexpected happened in the process. Styles once foreign became inseparable from Spanish identity. Take Toledo's synagogues. their Mudéjar artisans carved Hebrew prayers into walls patterned with arabesques, while Christian patrons turned a blind eye to the infidel decorations. Why? Because beauty, it seems, resisted dogma. Even the humble brick became a canvas for coexistence. Mudéjar masons stacked them into star-patterned towers for churches, their geometry echoing the mosques they'd once built for emirs. So can a building belong to two cultures? The answer lies in the very mortar holding these structures together, a mix of traditions so thoroughly blended that picking them apart is impossible. But this contest of styles wasn't confined to stone and tile. Listen closely, and you'll hear the same struggle in the words rolling off Spanish tongues, where Arabic phrases like Ojalá, God willing, slipped into prayer and poetry, as unstoppable as the morning light through a mosque's lattice. Step into the marketplace of 10th century Toledo, and you'd hear a symphony of tongues, merchants haggling in Arabic, monks murmuring Latin psalms, farmers bartering in the early cadences of what would become Spanish. Language wasn't just a way to communicate here. It was a battleground and a meeting point where words became bridges or walls depending on who wielded them. Arabic, the language of power and poetry, dripped from the lips of scholars and emirs, its script curling like vines across scientific treatises and palace walls. Yet beneath this veneer of elite culture, Romance dialects, the raw, evolving speech of ordinary people, bubbled up in kitchens and fields, steadily reshaping the linguistic landscape. At the heart of this transformation stood Toledo's legendary translation schools. After Christian forces reclaimed the city in the 11th century, something extraordinary happened. Instead of purging Islamic knowledge, they harnessed it. Teams of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars crowded around manuscripts, translating Aristotle's philosophy from Arabic to Latin via Hebrew, their pens moving as swiftly as their debates. Think of it as medieval crowdsourcing. A scholar might read Arabic aloud while a Jewish scribe rendered it into Hebrew, only for a Mozarab Christian to finally translate it into Latin. This wasn't just about words, it was about salvaging entire worlds of thought. Greek logic, Persian astronomy, and Indian mathematics flowed through these linguistic pipelines, fueling Europe's intellectual revival. But the real revolution happened outside academia, in the way people spoke and wrote their daily lives. Ladino, the vibrant tongue of Sephardic Jews, wove Old Spanish with Hebrew borrowings, its songs and proverbs penned in elegant Hebrew characters. Then there was El Jamiado, a linguistic chameleon used by Moriscos, Muslims living under Christian rule. Imagine reading a love poem or a shopping list written in Arabic script, only to realize the words themselves were pure romance. My corazón está con vos, my heart is with you, disguised in flowing calligraphy. These weren't just languages, they were acts of cultural camouflage and resilience, proof that speech could defy borders long after armies drew them. Yet as the Reconquista neared its end, the tides turned violently. The Alhambra Decree of 1492 didn't just expel Jews, it sought to scrub Hebrew from Spanish soil. Moriscos faced similar pressures, their Arabic books burned in public squares. The message was clear: unity for Spain's new Catholic monarchs meant uniformity. But languages are stubborn things like water, they seep through cracks. Today, when Spaniards say acete for oil or azúcar for sugar, they're unwittingly tasting the Arabic that once flavored every conversation. Even the humble Ojalá, sighed for distant hopes, carries the ghost of Inshallah, a whisper of coexistence that refused to be silenced. What's astonishing isn't that these languages clashed, but how much they gave each other in the collision. Arabic gifted Spanish its lyrical abstractions and precise scientific terms, while Romance dialects injected street-level vitality into legal documents and songs. The real tragedy, Just as Toledo's scholars proved how much cultures gain by sharing words, politics insisted they lose by dividing them. Yet in quiet corners, a Ladino lullaby, a Mudéjar arch, a farmer's proverb, the old multilingual Spain still murmurs, reminding us that every word we speak is a palimpsest layered with histories we've forgotten. And that sets the stage for an even richer exchange, the flow of ideas that turned medieval Spain into Europe's unexpected beacon of knowledge. While the rest of Europe was still emerging from the so-called Dark Ages, the libraries of Córdoba glowed like beacons in the night, literally. By the 10th century, Al-Andalus had become the West's unrivaled center of learning, where physicians dissected texts instead of bodies, astronomers mapped the heavens with startling precision, and philosophers debated Aristotle with the same fervor as imams discussed the Quran. At the heart of this renaissance stood figures like Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, whose medical encyclopedia, the Canon, would remain Europe's standard textbook for 6 centuries. His meticulous descriptions of contagious diseases and anesthesia weren't just advanced for their time. They were revolutionary, blending Greek clinical observation with Persian and Indian remedies into something entirely new. Then there was Ibn Rushd, or Averroes, the brilliant jurist-philosopher who dared to reconcile faith with reason. His commentaries on Aristotle didn't just reintroduce the ancient thinker to Europe, they sparked an intellectual wildfire. When medieval scholars in Paris and Bologna first encountered his works, translated from Arabic into Latin, it was as if someone had thrown open the shutters in a dim room. Suddenly, questions about the natural world could be explored without contradicting divine law, paving the way for the scientific method itself. But here's the twist: much of this Arabic knowledge wasn't originally Arabic at all. Nestorian Christians had first translated Greek texts into Syriac, Persian scholars preserved them, Baghdad's House of Wisdom rendered them into Arabic. By the time these works reached Spain, they'd been annotated by Jewish doctors, debated by Berber mathematicians, and refined by Andalusian agronomists. The astronomical tables of Al-Zarqali, for instance, didn't just predict planetary movements. They wove together Babylonian data, Ptolemaic models, and observations from Toledo's rooftop observatories. Knowledge, it seemed, refused to stay in neat cultural boxes. Christian Europe's rediscovery of this treasure trove was fraught with contradictions. In Toledo's scriptoriums, monks pored over Arabic manuscripts, their hands blackened with ink as they copied Avicenna's medical advice word for word, only to later claim these ideas as rediscovered Greco-Christian wisdom. The same scholars who condemned Islam as heretical eagerly adopted its algebra, its optics, even its surgical tools. When King Alfonso X commissioned new star charts, his team didn't start from scratch. They updated Al-Zarqali's work, erasing his name but keeping his calculations. So who really owned these ideas? The answer might lie in the margins of a surviving manuscript from Córdoba, where a Christian scribe's Latin notes curl around an Arabic diagram of the human eye, while a Jewish trader's ledger sits tucked between its pages. Knowledge, like light, belongs to whoever stands ready to receive it. But as the Reconquista reached its climax, tolerance for such fluidity would harden, and the very scholars who bridged these worlds would find themselves on dangerous ground. The year 1492 is etched into history as the moment Spain's fragile tapestry of coexistence finally unraveled. With the fall of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold, Ferdinand and Isabella issued the Alhambra Decree, a proclamation that gave Spain's Jewish population an impossible choice: convert to Christianity, leave everything behind, or face death. Overnight, synagogues became churches, Hebrew prayer books turned to ash, and families who had lived on the peninsula for centuries packed their lives into bundles, fleeing to Ottoman lands or North Africa. But for those who stayed, taking baptismal names and crossing themselves in public, the real torment was just beginning. Conversion wasn't a one-time act. It was a performance that never ended, where every gesture, every meal, every whispered word could betray you. Enter the Inquisition with its network of informants and its obsession with purity of blood. Suspicion fell hardest on the conversos, Jewish converts accused of secretly lighting Sabbath candles or avoiding pork. In Seville, a woman named Maria Gonzalez was denounced by her own maid for washing her sheets on Friday afternoons, a subtle nod to Jewish ritual purity. In Toledo, the wealthy merchant Juan de Leon faced torture after a neighbor claimed he'd seen him, turning his back to the crucifix. The charges often defied logic. One man was prosecuted because he sang too cheerfully during Mass, while a woman's habit of staring at the sunset was taken as proof she was praying toward Jerusalem. The Moriscos Muslims forced to convert faced their own nightmares. In Valencia, authorities raided homes searching for hidden prayer mats or remnants of halal slaughter. A single Arabic word overheard in the marketplace could land an entire family in the Inquisitors' dungeons. Yet resistance took ingenious forms. Some baked tiny Quranic verses into loaves of bread, swallowing the evidence if soldiers came knocking. Others taught children catechism in Spanish while whispering the Shahada in Arabic at bedtime, keeping faith alive like a candle shielded from the wind. What does it mean to convert when the alternative is exile or death? For the poet Ibn Sahl of Seville, who embraced Christianity but wrote verses suffused with longing for Islam, it meant living with a heart split like pomegranate seeds. For the silversmith Abraham Senya, who became Fernan Perez after baptism, it meant crafting exquisite crosses for churches while engraving tiny stars of David on their undersides, a secret dialogue between his old God and new. But the most astonishing rebellion happened in plain sight. Mudéjar artists commissioned to decorate Christian altarpieces hid Arabic inscriptions in the folds of saints' robes. A choir stall in Cuenca's cathedral, carved by Morisco hands, blooms with floral patterns that, when viewed at dawn light, form the words, "Allah is merciful." Even in the Alhambra itself, plasterwork arabesques conceal Hebrew letters spelling out psalms, a silent protest in the palace where the decree had been signed. These weren't just acts of defiance, they were proof that identity, once woven into a culture's fabric, couldn't be unpicked by royal decree. And so, beneath the surface of Spain's golden age, a parallel world thrived, one where a woman might kneel in confession while counting prayer beads under her skirt, where a painter could depict the Virgin Mary with henna-stained hands, where the very walls of churches whispered in forbidden tongues. The tragedy wasn't just that people were forced to choose between faith and survival, but that their survival itself became an art form, a masterpiece of coded gestures and double meanings etched into the marrow of Spanish culture. Look closely at the vaulted ceilings of Seville's Casa de Pilatos, and you'll spot something startling: delicate stucco vines twisting into the unmistakable shape of Arabic calligraphy. These aren't accidents, they're acts of quiet rebellion. Morisco artisans, forced to convert after the Fall of Granada, hid verses from the Quran in the very palaces built to celebrate their defeat. Their tools, the same geometry that once adorned mosques, now repurposed to crown Christian chapels. A six-pointed star here, a Cufic inscription there, disguised as mere decoration. Even in the Alhambra's Catholic editions, the ceilings drip with honeycomb muqarnas, their mathematical perfection a silent testament to the hands that shaped them, hands that still remembered the rhythm of Islamic prayer. Jewish scribes employed a different kind of camouflage. In the Golden Haggadah, a lavish Passover manuscript created in Christian Spain, scenes of Exodus unfold in gilded borders, but tilt the page just so, and hidden among the foliage, tiny Hebrew letters spell out psalms of deliverance. For converso families risking everything to preserve their faith, these weren't just pretty details, they were lifelines. A child tracing the illustrations with their finger might unknowingly brush against the words of the Shema, learning their heritage in whispers. The risk was immense. One slip, one informant, and these treasures would fuel the bonfires of the Inquisition. Yet the very fact that so many survived suggests a network of protectors. Christians who turned blind eyes, priests who chose not to scrutinize the art they commissioned too closely. What makes these hidden messages so powerful isn't just their secrecy, but their duality. A Mudéjar ceiling could be read two ways, as a triumph of Christian patronage for those in power, or as a map of lost Al-Andalus for those who knew how to look. A Hebrew initial hidden in a choir book's illumination was both a devotional object for the church and a smuggled letter for a persecuted community. This wasn't mere nostalgia, it was cultural photosynthesis, transforming oppression into something that could endure. And just as art carried these covert messages, so too did something even more universal: food. The same hands that shaped forbidden symbols into altarpieces also kneaded memory into loaves of bread. Saffron-infused arroz con pollo, slow-cooked in the style of a Persian pilaf, became Sunday supper in Christian homes. Eggplant stuffed with spiced lamb, once a dish for Ramadan, was rebranded as berenjenas a la morisca on monastery menus. Every bite was a palimpsest, flavors layered with histories too resilient to erase, which raises the question, when you can't speak your prayers aloud, can a recipe become a prayer instead? The answer lies in the kitchens of Toledo, where mortar and pestle kept time with the rhythms of a world that officially no longer existed. Take a single bite of Spanish cuisine today, and you're tasting centuries of hidden history. Behind the vibrant yellow of paella's saffron or the crunch of marzipan's almonds lies a story of conquest, conversion, and quiet resistance. When the Moors crossed into Iberia, they didn't just bring armies, they brought orchards. Citrus groves, date palms, and almond trees transformed the landscape, while spices like cumin and saffron rerouted trade networks. But here's the twist: by the time Christian kingdoms reclaimed territory, these foreign flavors had become indispensable. The humble cocido, a meat and chickpea stew simmered across Spain, tells the tale. In the south, it absorbed North African spices like paprika and saffron. In the north, it merged with Celtic pork traditions. The result, a dish that's neither fully Moorish nor wholly Christian, but something entirely new, a pot simmering with the paradox of cultural identity. Dietary choices became loaded with symbolism. Pork, forbidden in Islam and Judaism, turned into a public litmus test during the Inquisition. Conversos might be ordered to eat chorizo in front of witnesses to prove their conversion. Yet even here, subterfuge flourished. Some Morisco families roasted lamb with cloves and cinnamon, spices associated with Islamic feasts, but served it on Fridays to mimic Christian fast day meals. Others baked honey-drenched pestiños, pastries nearly identical to Ramadan's chabakia, but passed them off as Lenten treats. Every meal was a performance, but also a preservation, a way to keep ancestral flavors alive under new names. Then there's the case of Tehran, the almond and honey nougat now synonymous with Christmas. Its origins trace back to Al-Andalus, where it was a staple of Muslim wedding feasts. Christian rulers, eager to claim the delicacy, rebranded it as a Christian sweet, yet the recipe stayed unchanged, down to the Arabic technique of whipping egg whites into the honey. Even today, the best Tehran is still made in Gijona, a town once famed for its Moorish confectioners, but perhaps the most enduring rebellion was in the gardens. Hidden courtyards in Seville and Granada kept alive the Andalusian love of herbs and citrus long after the last mosque fell. Aromatic jasmine and bitter orange trees, originally planted for their scent and shade, became living heirlooms, their blossoms distilled into perfumes for church altars, their fruit twisted into marmalade bearing the Arabic name Mosarab. The act of tending these trees, of passing down recipes for eggplant with honey or spiced almond milk, became an unspoken act of defiance, and just as flavors crossed boundaries, so too did songs. In the cobbled streets of medieval Toledo, a troubadour's lute might strum a melody echoing both Gregorian chant and the nasal scales of Moorish nubas. The Cantigas de Santa Maria, commissioned by Alfonso X, blended Arabic poetic meters with hymns to the Virgin. Even flamenco's raw, grieving, cant jondo style carries whispers of Sufi devotional music and Jewish laments. When words were dangerous, rhythm and taste became the safest ways to remember. So the next time you hear the clatter of castanets or taste the tang of preserved lemons, listen closely. They're not just art or food, but living archives of a world that refused to disappear. Pluck the strings of an oud in medieval Cordoba, and the sound would ripple across faiths, a pear-shaped lute with a history as layered as the land itself. Originally crafted in Baghdad's workshops, this ancestor of the guitar traveled westward with merchants and minstrels, its warm, resonant tones finding eager audiences in Al-Andalus. Muslim poets strummed it to accompany verses of divine love, Jewish musicians tuned its strings for wedding processions, and Christian troubadours adopted it to serenade noble courts. The oud wasn't just an instrument, it was a cultural smuggler, carrying musical ideas across divides that swords couldn't breach. Listen closely to the Cantigas de Santa Maria, a collection of hymns commissioned by King Alfonso X in the 13th century, and you'll hear the paradox of medieval Spain distilled into melody. On the surface, these are devout Christian songs praising the Virgin, yet their rhythmic patterns, their microtonal inflections, even their hand-clapping percussion all betray their debt to the zajal, a popular Andalusian poetic form sung in Arabic. The cantiga's most famous refrain, Santa Maria, Strella Dudaya, Holy Mary, Star of the Day, floats on a tune that could have drifted straight from a Moorish courtyard. Alfonso's composers didn't just borrow, they blended, creating a musical hybrid as rich as the land's mixed soils. The troubadours of northern Spain took this fusion further. Wandering from castle to monastery, they sang of courtly love in verses that mirrored the ghazals of Persian poets, their meters echoing the cathedrals of Al-Andalus. Even the word troubadour itself may owe a debt to Arabic. Some scholars trace it to letter 1 E6D Arabia, meaning to sing or to delight. Their ballads, though often framed as Christian allegories, pulsed with the same imagery that filled Sufi poetry, gardens of longing, the agony of separation, the ecstasy of union. When the Occitan troubadour Macabrú sang of a lark breaking dawn with its wings, his listeners might not have known he was paraphrasing an Arabic proverb, but the resonance was there, vibrating beneath the surface. So can music dissolve borders? The answer lies in a remarkable manuscript from 13th century Toledo, where notation for a Hebrew psalm shares parchment with a Moorish lullaby and a Gregorian chant, all scribbled in the same hand. These weren't just songs, they were conversations, proof that melodies could cross where people often couldn't. Even in war, this exchange continued. Christian soldiers adopted the Moorish war drum, the atabal, to rally troops, while Islamic armies sounded brass trumpets copied from Byzantine models. The very instruments that marched armies into battle were themselves products of cultural theft and tribute, but if music could bridge worlds, it could also betray them. After the fall of Granada, Morisco musicians were ordered to abandon the oud for the guitarra latina, a Christian instrument, though its design still bore the oud's curves. The same notes that once celebrated coexistence now underscored conquest. Yet like a stubborn refrain, the old harmonies refused to fade entirely. Today, when a flamenco guitarist's fingers fly across the strings in a falsetto, those ancient echoes still hum, reminders that even in conflict, cultures never stop listening to one another. And as we'll see next, this dance of imitation and defiance extended far beyond music, shaping the very strategies of kings and caliphs on the battlefield. The clash of swords on the Iberian battlefield wasn't just a struggle for land. It was a collision of two warrior ideals, each sculpted by faith and sharpened by the other's presence. On one side stood the Ghazi, the Islamic holy warrior whose raids were as much about divine favor as territorial gain. His Christian counterpart, the knight, swung his broadsword under the banner of chivalry, a code that blended martial skill with courtly virtue. What's fascinating isn't just how they fought, but how they reshaped each other. The Ghazi's lightning-fast cavalry tactics, honed in North Africa's deserts, forced Christian knights to abandon their cumbersome chainmail for lighter armor adaptations that would eventually spread across Europe. Meanwhile, the Andalusian elite, watching their foes, began to romanticize the knight's cult of honor, weaving courtly love poetry into their own traditions. Siege warfare became a grim classroom for mutual learning. When Christian armies surrounded the fortress of Almeria in the 12th century, they employed trebuchets designed by Muslim engineers, the same engines that had pounded their own castles months earlier. Over in Zaragoza, the Taifa king Al-Muqtadir hired Christian mercenaries to defend his walls, their iron-clad formations inspiring his own guards to adopt heavier armor. Even the iconic Spanish espada, a straight double-edged sword, emerged from this dialogue, its balance perfected by Toledo's smiths, who combined the knight's thrusting technique with the curved slashing style of Moorish shamshirs. Yet amid the brutality, moments of unexpected reverence flickered like torchlight in a siege tunnel. Chroniclers tell of the Cid, that legendary Christian warlord, receiving a gift of superb Arabian steeds from his Muslim rival Al-Mu'tamin, a gesture of respect between men who'd crossed blades a dozen times. The Granadan emir Boabdil, defeated and exiled, was allegedly escorted by Ferdinand the Catholic himself to the coast, the victor acknowledging the dignity of his fallen foe. These weren't just courtesies, they were admissions that courage and skill transcended faith. So could enemies truly admire one another? The answer lies in the armor rooms of Madrid's Royal Armory, where a 15th century Christian breastplate is etched with Arabic calligraphy praising the Almighty, likely crafted by a Mudéjar artisan for his Christian lord. Or in the memoirs of Usama ibn Munki, a Syrian emir who marveled at Frankish medicine even as he fought crusaders, noting how a knight's tourniquet saved a wounded farmer's leg. Respect, it seems, could flourish in the unlikeliest soil, rooted not in shared beliefs, but in shared mastery of the warrior's art. This complex dance of conflict and admiration extended beyond the battlefield into the very laws that govern daily life. While knights and ghazis clashed in the fields, judges in both Christian and Muslim courts were quietly borrowing from each other's legal traditions, a convergence that would shape Spain's identity long after the last sword was sheathed. Beneath the soaring arches of Cordoba's great mosque, a Christian merchant could swear an oath on the Gospels before a cadi's court and have his testimony honored just as a Muslim's would. This was the Dhimma system in action, a legal framework that wove religious minorities into the fabric of Islamic rule. For Jews and Christians living under Al-Andalus, Dhimma status came with both protections and humiliations. They paid a special tax, the jizya, and faced restrictions on building new houses of worship, but their lives, property, and right to practice faith were guaranteed by law. Contrast this with the Sayyid Partidas, the legal code compiled under Alfonso X of Castile centuries later, where the tone shifts starkly. Muslims and Jews are labeled enemies of the faith, forbidden from holding public office, and pressured to convert through legal and economic penalties. The same land, the same sun, but two very different visions of justice. Yet reality was messier than legal codes suggest. In Toledo, after its Christian reconquest, the fueros local charters granted by kings allowed Mudéjar communities to keep Islamic inheritance laws and settle disputes in their own courts. A Muslim woman in 12th century Zaragoza might inherit half her brother's share under Sharia, while her Christian neighbor followed Castilian laws favoring male heirs. These fueros weren't acts of tolerance so much as pragmatism. Rulers needed the silk weavers, the irrigation experts, the tax revenue these communities provided. Justice, it seems, could bend when silver or silk was at stake. The deeper question lingers: can any legal system calling one faith true and others tolerated ever be truly fair? Islamic jurists argued the Dhimma system mirrored early Muslim treaties with desert tribes' protection in exchange for loyalty. Christian canon lawyers, meanwhile, cited Augustine's notion of compel intrare, compel them to enter, justifying pressure on non-believers for their own salvation. Both systems claimed divine sanction, yet both also bred contradictions. When Cordoba's emirs fined Christians for ringing church bells too loudly, was it maintaining public order or silencing dissent? When Valencia's Christian officials let Muslims swear on the Quran in court, was it respect or mere expedience? What's astonishing is how economics often softened these hard edges. A fatwa from 11th century Granada frets over whether Muslims could sell olive oil to Jewish merchants, not because of theology, but because the market demanded it. Christian kings, despite their rhetoric, routinely leased olive presses and silver mines to Jewish tax collectors, their piety outweighed by the clink of coins. The real glue binding these worlds wasn't law books but ledgers. The spice routes connecting Barcelona's markets to Marrakech, the silk workshops where Muslim weavers produced altar cloths for cathedrals. Even the jizya tax, often seen as oppressive, had an unintended consequence. It funded the very translators in Toledo who preserved Arabic science for Christian Europe. So perhaps the truest justice wasn't in the courts at all, but in the bustling port of Almeria, where a Genoese trader might haggle with a Berber shipmaster over Sicilian grain, both men speaking a pidgin of Arabic and Catalan, both bound by the oldest law of all, mutual need. The scales of trade, it turns out, could balance what the scales of dogma could not, and that delicate equilibrium between profit and prejudice, between law and livelihood, would shape Spain long after the last courtroom fell silent. The markets of Cordoba at dawn were a symphony of haggling voices and clinking scales, where sacks of saffron from Persia jostled for space beside bolts of Flemish wool and ivory from Mali. What made these bazaars extraordinary wasn't just the distance their goods traveled, it was the hands that passed them along. Jewish merchants, fluent in Arabic, Latin, and Romance dialects, became the indispensable middlemen of medieval Spain's economy. In Toledo's silk exchange, a single contract might bear signatures in Hebrew, Arabic, and Castilian, binding Muslim weavers, Christian nobles, and Jewish distributors into a network where profit trumped piety. When the Caliph of Cordoba needed Venetian glass for his palace lamps, it was a Jewish trader from Tortosa who negotiated the deal, navigating Christian ports and Islamic customs with equal ease. This economic dance thrived on calculated pragmatism. Islamic law prohibited Muslims from charging interest, so Jewish and Christian bankers filled the gap, financing everything from olive harvests to royal dowries. The same Christian kings who preached crusades against the Moors quietly leased silver mines to Jewish tax collectors, their zeal tempered by the need to fund armies. Even the dreaded jizya tax imposed on non-Muslims had an ironic upside. Jewish communities often pooled resources to pay it, creating communal coffers that doubled as credit networks for interfaith trade. The lesson was clear: when silver crosses hands, dogma tends to step aside. Does commerce create its own morality? The spice sacks of Al-Andalus suggest an answer. Muslim merchants swore by the Prophet's injunction against fraud, while Jewish traders adhered to Talmudic rules on fair weights, yet both systems converged on one principle: trust is the currency of trade. A Genoese sailor might distrust the infidel in prayer, but he'd trust the same man's word on the quality of Syrian pepper. The real heresy wasn't dealing with the other side, it was defaulting on a debt. This pragmatism shaped cities as much as markets. Walk through Toledo's labyrinthine streets, and you'll notice something startling. The Jewish quarter's narrow alleys funnel into the Grand Plaza where the cathedral now stands, while the old Moorish bathhouses nestle beside Christian granaries. Urban planning here wasn't about segregation but symbiosis. Cordoba's great mosque rose beside the Roman bridge, not just for spiritual gravitas, but because that's where the caravans from Seville unloaded. Even the chimneys of Malaga's sugar refineries, built by Muslim engineers but owned by Genoese investors, sent up the same sweet smoke whether the workers inside crossed themselves or knelt toward Mecca. The true testament to this coexistence lies in the mundane. A ledger from 14th century Valencia records a debt owed by a Christian knight to a Jewish moneylender, guaranteed by a Muslim silk merchant. Three faiths bound not by theology but by a signature and a seal. When the knight defaulted, it wasn't a priest or imam who settled the dispute. It was the guild of notaries, their authority carved not in scripture but in the shared language of commerce. And that language, it turns out, could build bridges sturdier than any cathedral's arch. Toledo's tangled alleyways tell a story of coexistence written in stone and water. Step into its Jewish quarter, and you'll find the synagogue of Santa Maria la Blanca, built by Islamic craftsmen for Jewish worshippers under a Christian king. Its horseshoe arches and pine cone carved capitals a silent testament to collaboration. Just streets away, the Mosque of Cristo de la Luz, later converted to a church, still bears its original Cufic inscription praising Allah's mercy alongside frescoes of the Virgin. This wasn't accidental adjacency, it was urban alchemy. Water, the lifeblood of the city, flowed equally through all quarters via acequias irrigation channels adapted from Roman and Moorish engineering, maintained by Jewish, Christian, and Muslim hands alike. Public fountains became neutral ground where women of all faiths gathered, their clay jars filling to the same rhythm while children played in the shadows of watchtowers and minarets. But tolerance had its tides. After the Christian Reconquest, Toledo's Jewish quarter was relocated, not walled off, but nudged closer to the Alcazar, a move both protective and controlling. Segregation waxed and waned with political winds. In peaceful eras, markets spilled across district lines. During tensions, gates were locked at curfew. Yet even at its most divided, the city's design resisted absolute separation. The Transito synagogue's windows deliberately faced Christian convents, allowing Jewish worshippers to hear church bells while their own prayers drifted outward. Shared bathhouses, though often scheduled by faith, used the same underground furnaces, their heat circulating beneath all who came to cleanse. Could bricks and aqueducts really shape harmony? Valencia's Velutas district offers a clue. Here, silk weavers, Muslim, Jewish, and Christian clustered around a single water wheel, their looms humming in unison. The neighborhood's layout forced interaction. Narrow streets funneled workers into shared courtyards where designs were bartered over steaming cups of spiced wine. When riots flared elsewhere, these alleys often remained calm, not because people loved one another, but because interdependence was woven into the urban fabric. Break the peace and the silk trade collapsed for all. Festivals, though, were where these careful boundaries dissolved entirely. During Toledo's Corpus Christi processions, Mudéjar musicians played pipes beside Christian choirs, while Jewish merchants hawked sugared almonds to the crowds. In Murcia, the springtime Fiesta de la Primavera saw Muslim farmers dance with Christian shepherds around bonfires lit on old Roman plazas, a temporary truce in the calendar where culture, not creed, took center stage. These weren't just celebrations, they were pressure valves, moments when the city's strict compartments could breathe. And as the drums echoed off the same walls that divided daily life, something remarkable happened. For a few fleeting hours, the map of us and them faded into the twilight. Under the scorching Spanish sun, two processions could unfold on the same cobbled streets, one marking Ramadan's end with rhythmic drumbeats and trays of honey-drenched pastries, the other somberly bearing crosses through Holy Week's torchlit nights. At first glance, these rituals couldn't be more different. Eid al-Fitr's jubilant breaking of the fast verses, Lenten penances, hushed introspection. Yet peel back the surface and you'll find startling parallels. Both turned cities into stages where faith became spectacle, where the scent of spiced lamb and saffron buns mingled with incense, where entire neighborhoods paused their feuds to kneel or break bread together. For Moriscos living under Christian rule after the Reconquista, these public celebrations became a high-stakes masquerade. Officially, they attended Mass during Semana Santa, their heads bowed as statues of the Virgin floated past. But behind shuttered windows, families risked everything to observe Eid in secret. A child's delighted gasp at finding a silver coin hidden in a bowl of couscous, the furtive exchange of gifts wrapped in plain cloth. Some historians believe the famous Mones de Pascua, Easter cakes still baked in Valencia today, began as covert replicas of Eid's marmal pastries, their citrus zest and cinnamon masking forbidden dates. Even the act of cleaning homes before Holy Week mirrored the ritual purity of Ramadan preparations, allowing Moriscos to honor tradition under the watchful eyes of informants. Festivals, it turns out, were both bridge and battleground. In towns like Avila, Christian and Muslim musicians once played side by side during spring fairs, their melodies weaving into something neither wholly sacred nor secular. Yet the same processions that fostered unity could also sharpen divisions when floats depicting triumphant Christianity rolled through former Muslim quarters, or when Morisco dancers performing ancestral steps were heckled as infidels. The paradox is haunting. The louder the celebration, the more it could conceal. A tambourine's jingle might signal devotion to one listener, defiance to another. Women, often overlooked in chronicles of war and treaties, became keepers of these fragile traditions. A Morisca grandmother teaching her granddaughter to embroider Eid patterns onto christening gowns, a Jewish convert whispering Sabbath prayers while stirring a pot of a dafina stew for Friday's Christian supper. Their quiet acts of preservation shaped Spain's cultural DNA as much as any king's decree. In the courtyards of Seville, Christian and Muslim women bartered not just spices and silks, but secrets, home remedies, lullabies, the art of folding dough so it held memories like a hidden letter. While men debated theology in mosques and cathedrals, these women wrote a different scripture, one etched in henna, hummed over cradles, and served steaming on festival days when no one was watching too closely. What does it mean to celebrate when joy itself must be smuggled? The answer lingers in the twilight of a Granada alley, where the echo of a flute playing a Lenten hymn might just carry the ghost of an old Andalusian love song, proof that even in silence the past finds ways to dance. In the shadows of castle walls and palace courtyards, women wove their own threads into Spain's cultural tapestry, sometimes with silk, sometimes with steel. Take Isabella of Castile, that iconic queen whose name evokes the Reconquista's final act. Few know she draped herself in Granada's finest Moorish textiles, her gowns embroidered with Arabic calligraphy that whispered power in every stitch. The same ruler who championed the Inquisition also kept an Andalusian perfumer at court, her chambers fragrant with jasmine oils pressed by Muslim hands. This contradiction wasn't hypocrisy, it was strategy. For noble women like Isabella, adopting the enemy's luxuries wasn't surrender. It was a silent claim to their sophistication, a way to outshine rivals while proclaiming dominance over the conquered. Yet other women wielded influence through ink rather than edicts. In 11th century Cordoba, the poetess Walada bint al-Mustakfi held court in a salon where men hung on her verses. Daughter of a caliph, she scandalized elites by embroidering her robes with lines like, "I am fit for high rank by God's will, I walk with pride." Her love affair with the poet Ibn Zaydun became legend, their exchanged poems a public dialogue blending Islamic mysticism with earthy passion. Walada's defiance went beyond romance. She educated freed slave girls in her home, turning literacy into liberation decades before universities admitted women. Between these extremes lay countless untold stories. Jewish moneylenders like Doña Gracia, men's Nazi bankrolled monarchs while secretly funneling refugees from the Inquisition. Morisca healers preserved herbal remedies in Christian kitchens, their knowledge disguised as old wives' tales. Even within convents, nuns like Teresa of Avila channeled Sufi-like ecstasies into Catholic mysticism, her writings echoing the very Muslim mystics Spain sought to erase. What made these women's navigation unique? While men fought over borders, women often blurred them. A Christian noblewoman might commission a Mudéjar carpenter for her chapel's ceiling, then hire a Jewish miniaturist to illuminate her prayer book. An Andalusian merchant's wife could broker deals between Genoese sailors and Berber traders, her multilingual whispers oiling the gears of commerce. Their power lay in interstitial spaces, the birthing chambers where midwives exchanged cures, the embroidery circles where stitches carried hidden symbols, the courtyards where lullabies blended Arabic and Romance melodies. The real question isn't whether women crossed lines, but how they redrew them. When Isabella's daughter Catherine brought Moorish-style tapestries to England's Tudor court, or when Walada's students penned verses in hybrid Arabic Romance dialects, they weren't just adapting, they were remaking the world on their own terms. And in that remaking, they laid the groundwork for something even more subversive, the quiet fusion of faiths that thrived in Spain's shadows. High in the hills of Extremadura, the shrine of the Virgin of Guadalupe rises over foundations that once echoed with the call to prayer. This isn't just another Catholic pilgrimage site, it's a spiritual palimpsest. The Virgin's dark-skinned image, venerated by millions, was said to have appeared to a humble shepherd in the 14th century, not far from the ruins of a Moorish mosque. To the faithful, her dark complexion was a mystery. To historians, it's a clue. Some scholars trace her origins to the Arabic Wadi al-Lub, meaning hidden river, while others see her as the spiritual heir to pre-Islamic earth goddesses worshipped on that same spot. The truth may lie in between, a sacred figure reborn through layers of devotion, her shrine's very stones whispering of adaptation rather than erasure. This blending of holiness wasn't unique. Across medieval Spain, Sufi mystics and Christian ascetics often found themselves speaking the same spiritual language, despite the gulf between their faiths. Take Ibn Arabi, the great Sufi philosopher from Mercia, whose writings on divine love, "My heart has become capable of every form. It is a pasture for gazelles, a cloister for monks," could easily be mistaken for the ecstasies of Saint John of the Cross centuries later. Both spoke of faith as a burning away of self, a journey into the dark night of the soul where dogma falls away and only the divine remains. Even their metaphors overlapped. The Sufis' yearning for union with the beloved mirrored the Christian mystics' bridal mysticism where the soul weds Christ. In the mountain caves of Andalusia, these parallels became tangible. Hermits like the Franciscan Juan de la Peña lived alongside Muslim Zahids, sharing not just the harsh landscape but practices too. Fasting, all-night vigils, the rhythmic chanting of sacred names, these weren't just coincidences but points of contact. When the Sufi poet Al-Shishtari sang of dancing in the flames of love, he might have been describing the ecstatic trances of the Beghards, a Christian lay order later condemned as heretical. Even the rosary, now synonymous with Catholic devotion, likely evolved from Muslim prayer beads carried back by pilgrims from the East. But could such spiritual kinship survive the tides of conquest? The fate of Guadalupe's mosque-turned sanctuary suggests an uneasy answer. As Granada fell in 1492, the same year Jews were expelled, Isabella the Catholic ordered the great mosque of the Albaycin quarter dismantled, its stones hauled uphill to build her new church. Yet in a twist of irony, the masons she employed were Mudéjars, Muslims now under Christian rule, who carved crosses over the same geometric patterns their fathers had crafted for emirs. The Virgin's shrine, like Spain itself, became a contradiction, a symbol of triumph that couldn't quite erase what lay beneath. Perhaps the final word belongs not to kings or clerics, but to a legend whispered in both Granada's Alpujarras hills and the monasteries of Castile. It tells of a Sufi and a monk who met by chance at a desert spring. The monk offered bread, the Sufi shared dates. Neither could understand the other's prayers, but as night fell, their voices merged in a wordless melody that drew wolves and doves alike to listen. Whether the tale is true matters less than what it reveals, that in the silence beyond language, beyond dogma, something essential still resonated. And as the last Moorish banners were lowered over Granada's towers, that resonance, fragile, persistent, would linger like the scent of orange blossoms after rain. The morning mist clung to the towers of the Alhambra on January 2nd, 1492, as Boabdil, the last Nasrid Sultan, handed the keys of Granada to Ferdinand and Isabella. Legend paints the scene with tragic grandeur, the young ruler pausing at the mountain pass now called El Suspiro del Moro, the Moor's sigh, his mother's sharp rebuke ringing in his ears, "Weep like a woman for what you could not defend as a man." But history's reality was far messier. Boabdil had spent years vacillating between defiance and submission, his reign already fractured by civil war. The treaty he signed promised Granada's Muslims the right to keep their faith, their laws, even their mosques, a veneer of tolerance that would crumble within years. As the royal banners of Castile and Aragon unfurled over the Alhambra's highest tower, the Catholic monarchs knelt in its courtyard to give thanks, their prayers echoing through halls still scented with orange blossom and jasmine from the Nasrid's hurried departure. What followed was a masterclass in the fiction of peaceful conquest. At first, the victors played their part with chilling precision. Ferdinand donned Moorish silks to receive homage from Granada's elites. Isabella admired the Alhambra's delicate stucco work, even as craftsmen were already chipping away at its Arabic inscriptions. The city's new archbishop, Hernando de Talavera, learned Arabic to preach conversion gently, though his successor, the fiery Cisneros, would soon replace persuasion with force. For a brief moment, it seemed coexistence might endure. Then came the edicts, mosques seized for churches, Arabic books burned in the Plaza Bibrambla, and finally, the ultimatum convert or leave. The romantic myth of the Reconquista's climax obscures its bitter ironies. The same year Columbus sailed west under the cross of Christ, Spain expelled the scholars and artisans who'd preserved the astronomical knowledge that made his voyage possible. The Alhambra's conquerors moved into its palaces, yet found themselves sleeping under ceilings inscribed with Quranic verses they couldn't read. And Boabdil, granted a petty lordship in the Alpujarras, lasted barely 2 years before fleeing to Morocco, where he died in obscurity, his palace reduced to a tourist curiosity for European travelers. But Granada's true fall wasn't marked by a single surrender. It unfolded in the decades after, as Morisco rebellions were crushed, as inquisitors rooted out crypto-Muslim practices like ritual baths or avoiding pork. It echoed in the silence of empty silk workshops and abandoned irrigation channels, their engineers exiled or baptized at sword point. Even the landscape bore witness. Olive groves planted by Muslim hands were torched during uprisings, their ashes leaching into the same soil that had once fed Al-Andalus's golden age. So is conquest ever truly complete? The Alhambra's walls seem to whisper their answer. Peel back the gilded Christian altars, and you'll find Arabic poetry hiding in the plasterwork. Lift a floor tile in the Hall of the Ambassadors, and the original star-patterned pavement still gleams beneath. The stones remember what the chronicles omit, that erasure is always imperfect, that culture refuses to be unmade as cleanly as borders on a map. And perhaps that's the final lesson of Granada. Victory may rewrite history, but it can never fully erase the fingerprints of those who built what was taken. The demolition began with the minarets, those slender fingers of stone that had once called the faithful to prayer across Seville's skyline. When Christian conquerors took the city in the 13th century, they didn't just topple the great mosque's tower, they hollowed it out, grafting a belfry onto its bones and baptizing it La Giralda. The call to prayer was replaced by the clang of church bells, but the structure itself, with its intricate brickwork and geometric lace, remained defiantly Moorish. This wasn't just architectural repurposing, it was a statement. Every time the bells rang, they proclaimed victory over the old order while standing atop its foundations. The campaign to erase Al-Andalus went far beyond buildings. In Granada, after the fall of the Nasrids, Archbishop Cisneros ordered a bonfire of Arabic manuscripts in the Plaza Bibrambla. Thousands of volumes on medicine, astronomy, and philosophy fed to the flames. A witness described how the smoke blotted out the sun for days, the ashes settling over the city like a shroud. Among the lost works were Ibn al-Khatib's treatises on contagion, centuries ahead of their time, and al-Zarawi's surgical diagrams that had guided European barber surgeons. The irony was bitter. The same knowledge that had once flowed from Al-Andalus to fuel Europe's Renaissance was now deemed too dangerous to exist, but the most intimate erasures happened in homes. Morisco children were seized from their families to be raised by Christian guardians, their Arabic names replaced with saints' names like Maria or Juan. In Valencia, parish records show infants baptized as Francisco one day, only to reappear years later as Yusuf in Inquisition trials, proof that names like faith could be worn as masks. Women bore the brunt of this cultural stripping. Moriscas were forbidden from wearing traditional almalafas, their veils recast as symbols of backwardness, while their recipes for eggplant stew or almond pastries were rebranded as Spanish dishes. What does it cost to unmake a culture? The answer lies in the silence that followed. The acequias, those intricate irrigation channels that had turned arid plains into orchards, fell into disrepair without the Muslim engineers who designed them. The silk workshops of Granada, once Europe's finest, dwindled as weavers fled or forgot their craft. Even the language faded. By the 16th century, a Morisco court speaking Arabic could face imprisonment, leaving entire generations cut off from their grandparents' poetry and prayers. Yet some echoes refused to be silenced. In the hills of the Alpujarras, Morisco rebels hid Quranic verses inside amulets, their ink mixed with pomegranate juice to evade detection. Mudéjar artisans commissioned to carve choir stalls for cathedrals tucked tiny six-pointed stars into the woodwork as secret homage to the geometry of lost mosques. And in the most unexpected places, the past persisted. The lullabies murmured to children at night, the saffron thread stirred into paella, the way a grandmother might still trace the shape of a protective hand against evil when no one was watching. The tragedy of Al-Andalus isn't just that it fell, but that its conquerors worked so hard to pretend it had never existed. Yet culture, like water, has a way of seeping through cracks. Even today, when a flamenco singer's voice breaks into the raw, nasal tones of a canciondo, or when a gardener in Cordoba tends an orange tree planted by Moorish hands, the old world flickers back to life. The question isn't whether a culture can be unmade, but whether the hands that try to erase it can ever truly wash away all the traces. Even as the Inquisition scrubbed Arabic from official records, the land itself refused to forget. Ride through Andalusia today, and the road signs tell a secret history: Guadalupe, Almuñécar, Ben el-Medina, each name a fossilized Arabic phrase. Wadi al-Far means river of happiness. Hisn al-Munakab translates to fort of the arched windows. These aren't just pretty sounds, they're linguistic footprints, marking where Moorish farmers diverted rivers into acequias that still water olive groves today. Modern tractors now plow fields using the same terracing techniques developed by 10th century agronomists like Ibn Bassal, whose manual on crop rotation lies buried in Vatican archives, even as his methods feed Spain's tables. Listen to the wail of a flamenco singer, and you might catch the ghost of a muwashsha, those intricate Arabic love poems that once drifted through Cordoba's courtyards. Scholars still spar over the genre's origins. The guitarist's rapid-fire rasguido echoes the strum of an oud. The dancer's percussive zapatado mirrors Sufi whirling. The raw grief in canciondo channels the same intensity as a muezzin's call. When Garcia Lorca called flamenco the cry of history, he wasn't speaking metaphorically. He was naming the unbroken thread stretching from medieval Zajal poets to today's dimly lit tablaos. In Granada's caves, where gypsy families have sung for generations, the past resurfaces in unexpected ways. A lullaby crooned to a child might contain the Arabic word alhamdu, disguised as nonsense syllables. A recipe for alla gitana, gypsy stew, lists ingredients: chickpeas, saffron, pumpkin, identical to a 13th century Andalusian cookbook's tufeleya. These aren't accidents. They're cultural survival strategies, as deliberate as the Moriscos who etched Quranic verses into their doorframes beneath layers of whitewash. Now, a quiet revolution is brewing in university archives and village festivals. Linguists are mapping the over 4,000 Arabic loanwords in Spanish, from azúcar, sugar, to albondiga, meatball. In Alpujarra villages, workshops teach children to reconstruct medieval water wheels using Ibn Layun's agricultural treatises. Even the Spanish government, after centuries of denial, now funds excavations of Medina Azahara, the ruined caliphal city that once rivaled Baghdad. So can the past ever truly be silenced? The answer might lie in a vineyard near Jerez, where the same grape varieties Ibn Firnas cultivated a millennium ago still sweeten the sherry aging in oak barrels. Or in a Seville courtyard where jasmine blooms at dusk just as it did when Walada bint al-Mustakfi recited her verses. Cultures don't vanish, they retreat into the cracks, waiting for the moment to whisper again. And as modern Spaniards debate their identity, torn between European Union policies and North African migrant boats, those whispers are growing louder, urging a reckoning with the hybrid history written in the very soil beneath their feet. Modern Spain's relationship with its medieval past is like a mosaic where some tiles have been pried loose and others cemented in place. Under Franco's dictatorship, the Reconquista wasn't just history, it was propaganda. Schoolchildren memorized dates of battles as if they were scripture, while textbooks painted the Christian conquests as Spain's divine destiny, a purity crusade against the foreign invader. The Caudillo himself paraded through Toledo's streets beneath banners evoking El Cid, framing his authoritarian rule as the spiritual heir to those medieval warriors. It was history weaponized, a narrative that erased 8 centuries of coexistence to forge a myth of eternal Catholic unity. Yet today, walk through Córdoba during its annual Patios festival, and you'll witness a quieter rebellion. Behind whitewashed walls, courtyards burst with geraniums and jasmine, their layouts unchanged since Moorish families designed them for summer shade. Homeowners compete not just for floral glory, but to preserve an architectural legacy that defies Franco's simplified story. Meanwhile, towns like Alcoy erupt each April with the thunder of Moros, while Cristianos parades a festival where locals don elaborate turbans and chainmail to reenact battles with choreographed flair. What began as a 16th century victory celebration now draws 500,000 spectators, its villains and heroes swapped yearly to challenge assumptions. Last year's Moorish general might be next year's noble defender, his costume woven with metallic threads by descendants of the very people his character supposedly conquered. The tension between these two Spains, one nostalgic for monolithic identity, another embracing complexity, plays out in unexpected places. When Córdoba's mosque cathedral charged entry fees in 2014, protests erupted over whether it should be labeled a monument rather than a place of worship, its dual identity suddenly a battleground. In Granada, tour guides debate how to describe the Alhambra's Christian additions. Are they vandalism or part of its layered story? Even Spain's immigration policies echo old contradictions, as Moroccan workers harvest olives in Andalusia while far-right politicians invoke the Reconquista to oppose mosques in their neighborhoods. Who controls this narrative? Scholars in Salamanca pore over rediscovered Arabic manuscripts, while YouTubers in Malaga animate the lives of medieval Jewish astronomers for Gen Z audiences. In a Barcelona museum, an interactive display lets visitors erase or restore layers of a virtual cathedral built over a synagogue, forcing choices about what heritage means. Meanwhile, chefs like José Andrés put medieval recipes on Michelin-starred menus, their dishes a delicious argument that Spanish identity was always remixing. The lesson stretches far beyond Iberia. From Myanmar to Mississippi, societies grapple with whose monuments stand and whose stories get told. Spain's medieval past offers a cautionary tale. Cultures that forget their complexity risk repeating its fractures. But it also holds hope, proof that even the most polarized histories can find new harmonies if we're willing to listen for them. Like the Alhambra's reflection shimmering in the Darro River, the past isn't gone, it's just waiting for the light to shift. The echoes of medieval Spain's cultural collisions resonate far beyond history books. They hum in the heart of today's most heated debates. From the minarets banned in Swiss skylines to the hijab controversies in French schools, the same questions that haunted Al-Andalus still linger: who owns a culture's symbols? Can a shared space ever truly be neutral? The Cordoba Mosque Cathedral stands as a living Rorschach test for these tensions. To some, its hybrid identity is a monument to coexistence, to others, a trophy of conquest. When the local Islamic Council requested permission to pray there in 2014, the uproar exposed raw nerves centuries after the Reconquista. The building's very stones remain contested ground. Yet in its paradox lies a provocative blueprint. What if we stopped seeing such spaces as either /or and embraced them as both /and? Across the Mediterranean, communities are testing this idea. In Lebanon's Byblos, a Crusader church and a Mamluk mosque share a courtyard where worshippers cross paths daily. In Sarajevo, the Gazi Husrev Beg Library preserves Hebrew scriptures alongside Ottoman Firman decrees, its curators calling it a vaccine against historical amnesia. Even Spain itself is tentatively reclaiming its layered past. In Granada, the Palacio de los Olvidados Museum now highlights Sephardic Jewish history, while chefs in Toledo revive recipes labeled Christian, Jewish, and Muslim on medieval menus only to reveal they're nearly identical. These aren't just gestures of reconciliation, they're experiments in a radical idea. That identity needn't be a zero-sum game. The stakes feel highest where migration and memory collide. When Syrian refugees arrived in Andalusia in 2015, some were housed in former convents built over mosques. A handful, recognizing the Qibla orientation of old prayer niches, quietly realigned their mats, a small act of continuity spanning 800 years. Meanwhile, far-right protesters draped in Reconquista banners marched outside, chanting slogans borrowed verbatim from 15th century edicts. History here isn't just remembered, it's relived, its scripts flipped and reused like palimpsests. Perhaps the most telling parallel lies in what gets preserved and what gets erased. Just as medieval scribes overwrote parchment to reuse it, modern societies constantly edit their cultural ledgers. Barcelona's medieval Jewish quarter, El Col, was buried under centuries of development until archaeologists began piecing it together from cellar walls and mikveh baths. In reverse, Seville's Metropole Parasol, a futuristic wooden structure, deliberately echoes the city's lost Moorish latticework, its architect citing the Alhambra as inspiration. These choices matter because they shape whose stories feel central or marginal, which threads get woven into the national narrative. So can history teach us to share space? The answer might lie not in grand monuments, but in mundane moments. A Moroccan fruit vendor in Madrid's Plaza Mayor laying out figs the same way his ancestors did in the souks of Al-Andalus, a Spanish grandmother teaching her granddaughter to make Christmas almond cookies with a recipe that suspiciously resembles Ramadan's ma'ma'al. Cultures like rivers refuse to run straight. They meander, merge, and carve new channels. The lesson of medieval Spain isn't that coexistence was easy or perfect, but that it was possible, and that its fractures often came not from difference itself, but from the refusal to acknowledge how much had already been shared. As the call to prayer drifts over Cordoba's orange trees at dusk, mingling with the cathedral bells, the past whispers a simple truth. Walls may divide, but courtyards, those fluid, fragrant spaces where life unfolds, always find ways to connect. Centuries of clashing swords and shared bread, of towering cathedrals built atop mosque foundations, of poetry scrawled in margins and recipes whispered in kitchens. This is the legacy Spain's soil still breathes. The story of Islamic and Christian Spain isn't a tidy chronicle of winners and losers, but a mosaic where every tile holds contradictions. From the Alhambra's honeycombed ceilings to the ink-stained pages of Toledo's translators, the evidence is everywhere. Cultures don't just collide, they converse, even when one tries to silence the other. What lingers isn't just the grandeur of caliphs or the fervor of crusaders. but the quiet resilience of those who refused to let beauty be buried. The Morisco artisan carving stars into a choir stall, the grandmother humming an old lullaby while kneading dough, the scholar smuggling knowledge across language lines like contraband silk. Federico Garcia Lorca once wrote that in Spain, the dead are more alive than anywhere else. Walk through Cordoba's Juderia at dusk and you'll feel it. The way shadows pool in Hebrew letters etched into door frames, the scent of orange blossoms that once perfumed a caliph's robes now drifting over cafe tables. History here isn't a closed book, it's a palimpsest where every erasure leaves a ghostly imprint. The walls do whisper if you lean close enough, in the flamenco's mournful cry that mirrors a muezzin's call, in the saffron-staining paella the same gold as a Nasrid tapestry, in the way a Spanish farmer still tends his acequias using methods penned by Moorish agronomists a millennium ago. So where does this leave us? Perhaps with an invitation to travel beyond the postcard views, to run fingers over the grooves in a cathedral's pillar where Arabic script was chiseled away, to taste the cumin and cinnamon that crossed continents in saddlebags. The lesson of medieval Spain isn't about who conquered whom, but how profoundly we shape each other, even in opposition. Cultures, like rivers, can't flow side by side without mingling in the undertow. If these hidden layers fascinate you, join us for more journeys into the stories etched beneath the surface. Hit subscribe and let us know in the comments where have you encountered history's quiet echoes. A recipe, a melody, a street name that hints at forgotten tongues. The conversation never really ended. It just learned to speak in code. As Lorca knew, some voices are too stubborn to stay buried.